She never expected to find love. She was forced to marry a Lakota war chief for peace. Sarah Whitmore stood by the window of her small room in the officers' quarters, watching the sunrise over the Dakota plains. The golden light stretched across the endless grassland, beautiful and terrifying all at once. She had lived at Fort Laramie for 3 years now, ever since her father had been assigned command of the cavalry unit stationed there. At 19 years old, she had grown accustomed to the harsh wind, the dust that seemed to settle on everything, and the constant tension that hung in the air like an approaching storm. Her father, Colonel James Whitmore, was a stern man with graying hair and tired eyes. The responsibility of keeping peace in this volatile territory had aged him considerably. Sarah worried about him constantly. She saw how he barely slept, how his shoulders sagged under the weight of decisions that could mean life or death for his men and the native people who had lived on these lands long before any fort was built. The year was 1868, and the conflicts between the United States cavalry and the Lakota Nation had grown increasingly violent. Treaties had been signed and broken so many times that trust had become a rare commodity. Sarah had heard the soldiers talking in hushed voices about massacres on both sides, about families destroyed and villages burned. She tried not to think about it too much. She spent her days teaching the children of soldiers and officers, losing herself in books, and writing letters to her aunt back in Boston. In those letters she painted a picture of adventure and frontier life, carefully leaving out the fear that often kept her awake at night. One morning in late summer, Sarah noticed something different. Her father had returned from a meeting with his senior officers, looking more troubled than usual. He barely touched his breakfast, and when Sarah asked if everything was all right, he simply patted her hand and told her not to worry. But Sarah knew her father well enough to recognize when something significant was happening. That evening, Colonel Whitmore requested that Sarah join him in his office. This was unusual. Her father kept his military matters separate from their personal life. When she entered, she found him standing by the window, his back to her, hands clasped behind him in that military posture he never quite abandoned even in private moments. Sarah sat down in the chair across from his desk and waited. The silence stretched uncomfortably. Finally, her father turned to face her. His expression was grave, almost pained. He began to explain the situation in a careful, measured voice. Chief Red Cloud, one of the most respected and powerful Lakota leaders, had sent a delegation to the fort. The message was clear. The violence must stop, but it would require a gesture of true commitment from both sides. Sarah listened as her father described the proposal. A marriage alliance, an ancient practice meant to bind two groups together through family ties. Her heart began to beat faster as she realized where this conversation was heading. The Lakota had requested that Colonel Whitmore's daughter be given in marriage to one of their war chiefs, a man named Lakota. In return, they would guarantee safe passage for supply wagons, cease raids on nearby settlements, and work toward a lasting peace. The word given echoed in Sarah's mind. Given as if she were a possession, a treaty document to be signed and handed over. She felt the blood drain from her face. Her father continued talking, explaining that he had tried to find another solution, that he had argued and negotiated for days, but the reality was stark. His garrison was outnumbered, supplies were running low, and another conflict would likely result in massive casualties on both sides. The Lakota had specifically requested his daughter because they wanted assurance that this was not just another empty promise from the white leaders. Sarah found her voice, though it came out smaller than she intended. She asked about this man, Lakota. What did her father know about him? Colonel Whitmore sat down heavily in his chair. He had made inquiries. Lakota was approximately 28 years old, a respected warrior and leader among his people. He was known for his strategic mind and had been involved in several battles against cavalry forces. He had been married before, but his wife had died 2 years earlier. Beyond these basic facts, her father knew little. The room felt like it was closing in on Sarah. She thought of her plans, her dreams of eventually returning to Boston to live with her aunt and perhaps open a school for girls. She thought of the books she loved, the poetry she wrote in secret, the life she had imagined for herself. None of those dreams included being handed over to a stranger from a culture she knew nothing about except through the fearful whispers of soldiers and their wives. She asked her father the question she already knew the answer to. Did she have a choice? Colonel Whitmore looked at his daughter with eyes full of sorrow. He told her honestly that while he would never force her, refusing would almost certainly mean war. Men under his command would die. Lakota families would be destroyed. The fragile hope for peace would shatter completely. The weight of all those lives now rested on her shoulders. Sarah spent the next 3 days in a fog of disbelief and grief. The women at the fort treated her with a mixture of pity and admiration. Some called her brave. Others whispered that she was being sacrificed. Sarah felt neither brave nor sacrificed. She felt numb, as if she were watching someone else's life unfold from a great distance. The preparations happened quickly. There was no time for second thoughts or lengthy farewells. Sarah packed a small trunk with her most precious possessions, her mother's silver hairbrush, a few books, writing materials, and the simple dresses that seemed appropriate for her new life. She left behind her fancy gowns and delicate shoes. Somehow, she knew they would have no place where she was going. The ceremony was arranged to take place at a neutral location, between the fort and the Lakota camp. It was a cool morning when Sarah rode out with her father and a small escort of soldiers. Her hands trembled as she held the reins of her horse. She had barely slept, and her stomach churned with anxiety. When they arrived at the designated spot, Sarah saw the Lakota delegation waiting. There were perhaps 20 people on horseback, and even from a distance she could feel the weight of their gazes upon her. As they drew closer, her father pointed out Lakota. He sat tall on a painted horse, his long dark hair moving slightly in the breeze. His expression was completely unreadable, his face like carved stone. Sarah dismounted with her father's help, her legs unsteady beneath her. Up close she could see Lakota more clearly. He was tall and powerfully built, with sharp features and dark eyes that seemed to look right through her. He wore traditional clothing decorated with intricate beadwork, and there was an undeniable dignity in the way he carried himself. But there was also something cold and distant in his expression, a wall between them that seemed impossible to breach. The ceremony itself was brief and formal. Words were spoken in both English and Lakota, though Sarah understood none of the Lakota portions. An elder performed rituals that involved sage smoke and prayers to the four directions. Sarah and Lakota were instructed to join hands. His grip was firm but not gentle, his skin warm against her cold fingers. He looked at her only once during the entire ceremony, and in that brief glance, Sarah saw not hatred but something equally difficult, complete indifference. When it was done, Sarah was given a moment to say goodbye to her father. He embraced her tightly, whispering that she was stronger than she knew, that he would do everything in his power to ensure her safety, that she could send word if she needed help. Sarah clung to him, this last connection to everything familiar, before finally letting go. A horse was brought for her, and she mounted it with as much grace as she could manage. Lakota spoke a few words in Lakota to his people, then turned his horse toward the horizon. The group began to move, and Sarah had no choice but to follow. She looked back once and saw her father standing alone, watching her disappear into a life he could not protect her from. The ride to the Lakota camp took several hours. No one spoke to Sarah. She was surrounded by people whose language she did not understand, whose customs were foreign to her, whose world she was now expected to join. Lakota rode ahead, never once turning to check on her. Sarah felt like a piece of cargo being transported, not a bride being brought to her new home. When they finally arrived at the camp, Sarah was overwhelmed by the sight. Dozens of lodges spread across a valley, smoke rising from cooking fires, children playing, women working, and men tending to horses. Life was happening all around her, vibrant and complex, and she had no idea how she fit into any of it. People stopped to stare as the group rode through. Some faces showed curiosity, others suspicion, and a few displayed open hostility. Lakota dismounted in front of a large lodge and spoke briefly to an older woman who had emerged. Then, without a word to Sarah, he walked away. The older woman approached Sarah's horse and gestured for her to dismount. Her face was weathered and stern, but not unkind. She led Sarah into the lodge, which would apparently be her new home. Inside, the space was surprisingly comfortable, with furs spread on the ground and a fire pit in the center. The woman, whose name Sarah would later learn was Winona, showed her where she could place her belongings. Then she too left, leaving Sarah alone in the quiet lodge. Sarah sat down on one of the furs and finally allowed herself to cry. She cried for the life she had left behind, for the uncertainty ahead, for the coldness she had seen in her new husband's eyes, and for the loneliness that already threatened to consume her. She was married to a stranger in a strange land, and she had never felt more alone in her entire life. The first morning in the Lakota camp, Sarah woke to unfamiliar sounds. Children laughing in the distance, horses neighing, women calling to one another in a language that sounded like music she could not understand. For a brief, disorienting moment, she forgot where she was. Then reality crashed back, and she felt her chest tighten with anxiety. Lakota had not returned to the lodge the previous night. Sarah had waited, uncertain and afraid. But as darkness fell and he still did not appear, she eventually wrapped herself in one of the soft buffalo robes and tried to sleep. She had no idea where he had gone or if this was normal. Perhaps he was avoiding her. Perhaps this was how their marriage would be, two strangers sharing a space but never truly connecting. Winona arrived shortly after sunrise. The older woman carried a bundle of clothing and placed it near Sarah with gestures indicating she should change. Sarah's traveling dress, already dusty and worn from the journey, was clearly inappropriate for life here. The new clothes were made of soft deer skin decorated simply but beautifully with small beads and quill work. Sarah changed awkwardly, very aware of Winona's watchful eyes assessing her. Once dressed, Winona beckoned Sarah to follow her outside. The morning air was crisp and clean, the sky a brilliant blue that seemed to stretch forever. Sarah stayed close to Winona as they walked through the camp. Everywhere she looked, people were busy with the work of daily life. Women scraped hides stretched on wooden frames. Others stirred large pots over fires, and some sat in groups doing intricate beadwork while keeping watchful eyes on playing children. As Sarah and Winona passed, conversations would pause. Eyes followed Sarah, with expressions ranging from curiosity to suspicion. A group of younger women whispered and giggled, making Sarah's cheeks burn with embarrassment. She did not need to understand their words to know they were talking about her, probably about how awkward and out of place she looked. Winona brought Sarah to where several women were working together to process a deer that had been hunted the day before. Through gestures and simple demonstrations, Winona showed Sarah how to scrape the hide clean of fat and tissue. It was hard, messy work that made Sarah's hands ache and her back hurt. The other women worked with practiced efficiency, their movements smooth and quick while Sarah struggled clumsily with the unfamiliar tools. One of the younger women said something that made the others laugh. Sarah felt her face grow hot. She tried harder, but that only seemed to make things worse. The scraping tool slipped and nearly cut her hand. An older woman reached over and corrected her grip with an impatient sound, then returned to her own work without meeting Sarah's eyes. This became the pattern of Sarah's days. Winona would collect her each morning and bring her to wherever the women were working. Sarah tried to learn, but everything was difficult. The language barrier made even simple tasks complicated. When she tried to help gather roots and plants for food and medicine, she could not tell the useful plants from the useless or even dangerous ones. When she attempted to help set up a new lodge for a young couple, she could not follow the complex process and only got in the way. The children were the worst. A group of young girls, perhaps 10 or 11 years old, seemed to take particular delight in mocking Sarah's failures. They would imitate her clumsy movements and laugh uproariously. Once, when Sarah tripped over a tent rope and nearly fell, they dissolved into such fits of giggles that Sarah had to walk away to hide her tears of humiliation. Through all of this, Dakota remained distant. Sarah saw him occasionally from afar. He was always surrounded by other men, discussing matters that seemed important, or working with the horses, or leading groups out to hunt. Sometimes he would pass near their lodge, and Sarah's heart would race with nervousness, wondering if he would come inside, if he would speak to her, but he never did. He seemed to have no interest in her whatsoever. At night, Sarah ate alone in the lodge, picking at the unfamiliar foods that Winona brought her. Some of it was actually quite good, the meat flavorful and the stews rich, but Sarah's anxiety made it difficult to enjoy anything. She would lie awake on her sleeping furs, listening to the sounds of the camp settling for the night, feeling utterly alone despite being surrounded by hundreds of people. 3 weeks passed this way. Sarah learned a few basic Lakota words, mostly through desperate necessity. Waste meant good, sicka meant bad, Minnie was water. She could ask for simple things, but any real conversation was impossible. She began to observe Dakota more carefully during the times she caught glimpses of him around the camp. What she noticed surprised her. When disputes arose between people, others would bring them to Dakota to settle. He would listen carefully to both sides, his face thoughtful, before offering his judgment. People seemed to respect his decisions, even when they did not get what they wanted. When hunting parties returned successful, she saw him ensure that the widows and families without strong hunters received portions of meat first, before taking anything for himself. Children ran up to him without fear, and he would pause whatever he was doing to greet them with a gentle word or gesture. This was not the cold, heartless warrior she had imagined during those fearful days before the wedding. This was a man who carried responsibility for his people, who made difficult decisions, who showed kindness to those more vulnerable. Sarah found herself confused by this contradiction. How could someone be so caring toward his community, yet so completely indifferent to his own wife? One evening, about a month into her new life, Sarah became ill. It started with chills that made her teeth chatter despite the warm fire. Then came a fever that left her weak and disoriented. She tried to hide it, not wanting to seem even more useless than she already felt, but her body betrayed her. By nightfall, she was burning up, her head pounding, her limbs aching terribly. Winona came to check on her as usual and immediately recognized something was wrong. The older woman felt Sarah's forehead and made a concerned sound. She left quickly and returned with bundles of herbs and roots. Winona built up the fire and began preparing some kind of medicinal tea, muttering to herself in Lakota. Sarah drifted in and out of awareness, her fever making everything feel dreamlike and strange. At some point, she realized someone else was in the lodge. Through her haze, she recognized Dakota's silhouette against the firelight. He was speaking with Winona in low, serious tones. Then Winona left, and Dakota remained. Sarah tried to sit up, confused and embarrassed that he was seeing her like this, but she was too weak. Dakota moved closer and gently pressed her back down onto the furs. His hand was surprisingly gentle against her shoulder. He fed the fire, keeping the lodge warm. He brought her water and helped her drink when she was too shaky to hold the cup herself. When Winona returned with more medicine, Dakota prepared it carefully, brewing tea from the herbs exactly as the older woman instructed. The bitter liquid made Sarah want to gag, but Dakota held the cup steady to her lips and murmured something in Lakota that sounded encouraging. Through the long night, Dakota stayed. Sarah would wake from feverish sleep to find him sitting nearby, keeping watch, tending the fire. Once, when she cried out from a nightmare, disoriented and afraid, he was there immediately, his hand cool against her burning forehead, his voice low and steady, speaking words she could not understand but found comforting nonetheless. By morning, the fever had broken. Sarah woke feeling weak but clear-headed for the first time in hours. Dakota was still there, looking tired but relieved. Their eyes met, and for the first time since the wedding, he truly looked at her. Not through her, not past her, but at her, seeing her as a person, not just a political arrangement. He said something in Lakota, his voice quiet. Sarah had no idea what the words meant, but the tone was kind. Then he stood and left the lodge, leaving Sarah confused, but somehow feeling less alone than she had since arriving. After that night, something shifted slightly. Dakota did not suddenly become warm or affectionate, but the complete indifference was gone. Sometimes in the evenings he would come to the lodge and sit by the fire. They did not speak much, the language barrier too great, but his presence was no longer cold. Sarah began to notice small things he did. He would bring extra firewood before storms. He made sure she had warm robes as the weather grew cooler. Once he brought her a pair of beautifully made moccasins, perfectly sized for her feet, to replace her worn boots. Sarah continued struggling with daily tasks, but Winona grew more patient with her. The older woman would demonstrate things multiple times without showing frustration. Slowly, painfully slowly, Sarah began to improve. Her hands grew calloused from the work. Her movements became slightly less clumsy. She learned which plants were safe and useful. She began to understand snippets of conversation, picking up more words each day. One afternoon, Sarah was sitting outside the lodge practicing the beadwork Winona had been teaching her when she heard raised voices. Looking up, she saw a group of young warriors confronting Dakota near the horse corral. Their gestures were aggressive, their voices angry, though Sarah could not understand their words, but she could see they were challenging him, questioning him about something. The confrontation went on for several minutes, growing more heated. Finally, one of the young men pointed directly at Sarah, his expression contemptuous. The meaning was clear even without understanding the language. They were criticizing Dakota for marrying her, for bringing an outsider into their community. Sarah's heart sank. She had known she was not wanted here. But hearing it spoken aloud, seeing the anger directed at both her and Dakota, made it painfully real. She started to stand, thinking perhaps she should go inside and not make the situation worse by being visible. But then she stopped. Something rose up inside her, a stubbornness she had inherited from her father. These people did not trust her, did not want her here. But Dakota had shown her kindness when she was sick. Winona had patiently taught her despite her many failures. She thought of the children who had finally started to smile at her instead of just mocking her. She thought of the old grandmother who had nodded approvingly when Sarah successfully tanned her first small hide the previous week. Sarah walked toward the group, her heart pounding so hard she thought everyone must hear it. The young warriors fell silent, surprised by her approach. Dakota's expression was unreadable. Sarah faced the man who had pointed at her, the one who seemed to be the leader of this challenge. In her slowly growing Lakota vocabulary, speaking carefully to get the words right, Sarah addressed him. She said that she knew she was not Lakota, that she had much to learn, that she made many mistakes. But Dakota was a good leader and a good man, and she would work hard to be worthy of being his wife and part of this community. Her pronunciation was probably terrible. Her grammar was certainly wrong. But the young warriors stared at her in surprise. The leader's aggressive posture softened slightly. uncertainty crossing his features. Dakota said something in Lakota, his voice firm and authoritative, and the young men nodded reluctantly before walking away. When they were gone, Dakota turned to Sarah. For a long moment, he simply looked at her. Then, for the first time since she had known him, he smiled. It was a small smile, barely there, but it transformed his face completely. He spoke a single word in Lakota that Sarah did not know, but somehow she understood it meant something like respect or perhaps approval. That evening, Dakota came to their lodge earlier than usual. He brought food and gestured for Sarah to sit with him by the fire. As they ate, he began pointing to objects and speaking their names in Lakota, then waiting for Sarah to repeat them. When she got something right, he would nod encouragingly. When she struggled, he would repeat it patiently. It was their first real conversation, conducted through single words and gestures and slowly growing understanding. It was not much, but it was a beginning. The first time since being forced into this marriage, Sarah felt a small spark of hope that perhaps, somehow, this impossible situation might become something bearable, maybe even something more. The autumn air grew colder, and Sarah had been living among the Lakota for nearly 3 months. Her hands, once soft and unused to hard work, were now calloused and capable. She could tan a hide without constant supervision, gather the right plants for cooking and medicine, and even help properly construct a lodge when families needed to relocate. The work was still difficult, but it no longer felt impossible. Her understanding of the Lakota language had grown considerably. She could hold simple conversations, understand most of what was said around her, and even occasionally make jokes that actually landed well enough to earn genuine laughter instead of the mocking kind she had endured in her early days. The children who had once tormented her now sometimes invited her to watch their games, and a few of the younger ones had started bringing her little treasures they found, smooth stones or interesting feathers, as gifts. The relationship between Sarah and Dakota had evolved into something she might cautiously call friendship. Most evenings now he would come to their lodge and they would sit together by the fire. He taught her more Lakota words and phrases, and she taught him English in return. His English was actually quite good already, something that had surprised her when he first revealed it. He had learned from traders and from observing soldiers, though he rarely spoke it, preferring his own language. During these quiet evenings they began sharing stories. Sarah told him about growing up as an only child, about her mother who had died from fever when Sarah was 12, about the loneliness of moving from fort to fort with her father, never quite belonging anywhere. She spoke of her love for books and learning, of her dream to one day teach children to read and write. Dakota listened carefully to everything she said. When he shared his own stories, Sarah learned about a life completely different from her own. He described his childhood learning to hunt and track from his father and grandfather, the pride he felt when he killed his first deer at age 11, the ceremonies and traditions that marked his passage into manhood. His voice grew quieter when he spoke of his first wife, Mika, whose name meant intelligent raccoon. She had been kind and gentle, and when she died during a cavalry raid on their winter camp, something inside Dakota had hardened. He had not wanted to remarry, had not wanted to risk that kind of pain again. Sarah understood then why he had been so cold to her initially. She was not just a stranger, she was the daughter of the very people who had killed his beloved wife. The fact that he had shown her any kindness at all spoke to a strength of character that Sarah found herself deeply respecting. One crisp morning, disaster struck in an unexpected way. A hunting party had gone out at dawn, Dakota among them. They were tracking a small herd of elk in the foothills several miles from camp. Sarah was working with Winona and several other women smoking strips of meat from a previous hunt when they heard the sounds of horses returning much earlier than expected. The hunters rode in quickly, and Sarah immediately noticed something was wrong. Dakota was slumped forward on his horse, his leg wrapped in what looked like a torn shirt, blood soaking through the makeshift bandage. Her heart jumped into her throat. The men were speaking rapidly in Lakota, explaining what had happened. From what Sarah could gather, Dakota had been climbing a rocky slope when loose stones gave way beneath him. He had fallen perhaps 15 feet, landing badly on his left leg. A sharp branch had torn through his buckskin leggings and deep into his thigh. Several men helped Dakota down from his horse. He was clearly in pain, but trying hard not to show it, his jaw clenched tight, his face pale. They began to carry him toward his lodge, and Sarah hurried ahead to prepare. She built up the fire for light and heat, laid out clean furs for him to lie on, and tried to think clearly despite the panic rising in her chest. When they brought Dakota inside and laid him down, Sarah got her first good look at the wound. The gash was deep and jagged, running about 6 inches along his outer thigh. It was still bleeding, though not as heavily as it must have been initially. Dirt and debris were embedded in the torn flesh, If it was not cleaned properly, infection would almost certainly set in, and infection could kill him. Winona arrived with her medicine bag, along with 2 other elder women known for their healing knowledge. They examined the wound and began discussing treatment in rapid Lakota. Sarah understood enough to know they planned to pack it with healing herbs and bind it, but she also saw what they were not doing. They were not planning to clean it thoroughly first, and they were not going to close the wound. Sarah's mother had been the closest thing to a doctor at several of the remote forts where they had lived. Sarah had assisted her many times, learning how to clean wounds, stitch them closed, and watch for signs of infection. She knew that leaving this wound open and simply packing it with herbs might work, but it also might not. The risk of infection was too high. She spoke up, her voice shaking slightly but firm. She told them she knew a different way, a way that might help the wound heal faster and cleaner. The elder women looked at her with skepticism. One of them said something dismissive, but Winona, who had become Sarah's advocate and supporter, asked her to explain. Sarah described what needed to be done. The wound must be cleaned thoroughly with boiled water, every bit of dirt and debris removed no matter how painful. Then it should be stitched closed to help the flesh knit back together properly. After that, yes, they could apply healing herbs and bandage it, and she would watch carefully for any signs of infection. Dakota, lying there listening to this discussion, spoke up. His voice was strained with pain, but his words were clear. He told the elder women to let Sarah try her way. He trusted her. The women looked unhappy, but nodded in deference to his wishes. They left to gather clean water and cloths, leaving Sarah alone with Dakota. Sarah knelt beside him, her hands trembling slightly. She had helped her mother with procedures like this, but she had never done one entirely on her own. Dakota reached out and caught her hand, squeezing it gently. He told her not to be afraid, that he believed she could do this. His confidence in her steadied Sarah's nerves. When Winona returned with boiled water and clean cloths, Sarah took a deep breath and began. First, she carefully cut away the torn leggings to fully expose the wound. Then, as gently as possible but thoroughly, she began cleaning it. Dakota made no sound, though she could see his hands gripping the furs beneath him, his knuckles white with the effort of staying still and silent. Sarah worked methodically, removing every piece of dirt and debris, washing the wound again and again with clean water until she was satisfied. The stitching was the hardest part. Sarah had to use a bone needle and sinew thread that Winona provided. Her mother had taught her the technique, but actually doing it, pushing the needle through Dakota's flesh, pulling the edges of the wound together, required all of her focus and courage. Dakota watched her work, his dark eyes never leaving her face, and somehow his steady gaze helped her hands stay calm. When she finished the final stitch, Sarah sat back, exhausted and shaking. The wound was closed, the stitches neat and even. She applied a paste made from healing herbs that Winona had prepared, then carefully bandaged the entire area with clean cloths. Only when it was completely done did she realize she had been holding her breath. Dakota spoke softly, thanking her. There was something new in his eyes when he looked at her now, something warm and grateful that made Sarah's heart flutter strangely. Winona nodded approvingly at Sarah's work and said something that sounded like praise. The other elder women examined the stitches with interest, murmuring to each other. Over the next several days, Sarah barely left Dakota's side. She changed his bandages twice daily, checking constantly for any signs of infection, redness, unusual swelling, or fever. She prepared special broths to help him regain his strength and made sure he stayed off the leg completely to allow it to heal. Dakota proved to be a terrible patient, constantly wanting to get up and resume his duties, and Sarah had to be surprisingly firm with him, reminding him that if he did not let it heal properly, he might never walk without a limp. During this time of forced rest, they talked more than they ever had before. Dakota asked Sarah about the medical knowledge her mother had taught her, fascinated by the different approach to healing. Sarah asked him about his responsibilities as a war chief, about the decisions he had to make, about what he hoped for his people's future. These conversations revealed depths to each other they had not known existed. Dakota shared his fears about the increasing pressure from white settlers, the decreasing buffalo herds, the broken promises from the government. He worried about what kind of future his people would have, whether the children growing up now would ever know the freedom and way of life he had known. Sarah listened and found herself seeing the situation from a perspective she had never considered before. She told him honestly about her own confusion, about how she had been raised to think of native peoples as savages who needed to be civilized or removed, but how living here had shown her that everything she had been taught was wrong. These were not savages. They were families, communities with rich traditions and deep wisdom, people who loved their children and cared for their elders and had complex systems of honor and justice. The real savagery, she was beginning to understand, came from those who would destroy this way of life without trying to understand it. One evening, about a week after the injury, Sarah was checking Dakota's wound and was pleased to see it was healing beautifully. The stitches were holding well, there was no sign of infection, and new skin was already beginning to form along the edges. She said as much to Dakota, smiling with relief. He caught her hand as she was putting away the medical supplies. When she looked at him questioningly, he spoke seriously, telling her that she had saved his life. If the wound had become infected, he would likely have died or at best lost the leg. She had given him a great gift, and he would not forget it. Sarah felt tears prick her eyes unexpectedly. She told him that he had given her gifts too, that he and Winona and others had taught her so much, had been patient with her failures, had given her a chance to belong here. He admitted something she had not fully acknowledged even to herself, that she no longer dreamed of escaping back to her old life. This place, these people, they had become something like home. The atmosphere in the lodge shifted in that moment. Dakota sat up carefully, mindful of his healing leg, and reached out to gently touch Sarah's face. It was the first truly tender gesture he had ever made toward her. Sarah's breath caught. He said her name, not the English Sarah, but the Lakota name the women had recently given her, Wichoppy Waist, Good Star Woman. They had named her this because she worked hard and tried to bring light to the tasks she did, even when they were difficult. He told her that he had been wrong about her, that he had judged her unfairly because of who her father was and where she came from. But she had proven herself to be strong, capable, and kind. She had earned her place here not through the marriage arrangement, but through her own actions and character. He was proud to call her his wife, and he hoped that perhaps she might someday be proud to call him her husband, not because she was forced to, but because she chose to. Sarah felt something break open inside her chest, some wall she had not realized she had built. She realized that somewhere along the way, through the shared evenings and exchanged stories and quiet moments of understanding, she had developed real feelings for this man. It was not the romantic love from the novels she had read as a girl, but something deeper and more solid, built on respect and shared experience and genuine care for each other's well-being. She told him truthfully that she was already proud to be his wife, that he was the most honorable man she had ever known, that she felt safe with him in a way she had never felt safe before. And then, for the first time since their cold, formal wedding ceremony 3 months ago, they came together in a real marriage, choosing each other freely with genuine affection and the beginnings of love growing between them. Winter arrived with a fury that Sarah had not anticipated. The winds howled across the plains, bringing snow that piled high against the lodges and froze the rivers solid. The temperature dropped so low that stepping outside felt like being slapped in the face. Sarah was grateful for the warm buffalo robes and the knowledge the women had shared about layering clothing and keeping warm in such brutal conditions. But winter brought more than just cold weather. It brought hunger. The buffalo herds, which had once been so plentiful that they darkened the plains like moving shadows, had become scarce. Sarah learned from the evening conversations around various fires that white hunters had been killing buffalo by the thousands, not for food or hides to use, but simply for sport or to sell the tongues as delicacies back east. Massive carcasses were left to rot on the prairie, a waste so enormous and senseless that Sarah felt sick when she heard about it. The Lakota depended on the buffalo for nearly everything. The meat fed them, the hides clothed and sheltered them, the bones became tools, the sinew became thread. Without adequate buffalo, the people faced starvation. The hunters went out regularly despite the dangerous cold, but they often returned with little or nothing. The stored food from autumn was being carefully rationed, but everyone knew it would not last the entire winter at this rate. Sarah saw children with hollow cheeks and her babies crying from hunger. The elders insisted the young ones eat first, and Sarah watched as grandmothers and grandfathers grew thinner, giving their portions to ensure the next generation survived. It broke her heart. She found herself eating less as well, saving what she could for the children she had grown fond of over the months. Dakota, now fully recovered from his injury, spent long hours in council with the other leaders and warriors. The discussions grew heated as different factions argued about what should be done. Some of the younger warriors wanted to raid the supply wagons that traveled between the forts, to take by force what they needed to survive. Others argued this would break the fragile peace and bring the full might of the cavalry down upon them. The debates went in circles, tension building with each passing hungry day. One evening, as Sarah and Dakota sat together in their lodge, she cautiously raised an idea that had been forming in her mind. She suggested that perhaps she could go to Fort Laramie, to her father, and ask for help. Surely the army had supplies that could be spared temporarily, just enough to help the people survive until spring when hunting would improve. Dakota's reaction was immediate and sharp. He said no, his voice harder than it had been in weeks. He would not go begging to the white soldiers for help. It would make them look weak and desperate, would give the army leverage to demand more concessions, more land, more restrictions on their freedom. He had his pride and his people had their dignity. They would find another way. Sarah tried to argue gently that pride would not fill empty stomachs, that children's lives were more important than political positioning. But Dakota remained firm, growing angry in a way she had rarely seen. The conversation ended badly, with Dakota leaving the lodge abruptly and Sarah sitting alone feeling frustrated and helpless. The situation grew worse over the next 2 weeks. A winter storm trapped everyone in camp for 4 days, making hunting impossible. When it finally cleared, the hunters found nothing. The food stores were now critically low. Sarah heard whispers that some families were down to 1 small meal per day. The mood in the camp shifted from worried to desperate. Then came the morning when scouts rode in with alarming news. Cavalry soldiers had been spotted in the hills to the east, closer to Lakota territory than they should have been. The camp erupted into activity. Were they being watched? Was an attack coming? The warriors prepared weapons and organized patrols. Families packed essential items in case they needed to flee quickly. Fear rippled through everyone. That night, Sarah lay awake long after Dakota had fallen into an exhausted sleep beside her. She thought about the children she had seen that day, their large eyes and thin faces, their unusual quietness. She thought about the elder who had collapsed from weakness while trying to carry water. She thought about her father, alone at Fort Laramie, probably worried about her welfare, but having no idea how desperate the situation had become. Before she could talk herself out of it, Sarah made a decision. She would go to the fort herself, without telling anyone beforehand. She would plead with her father for help, and she would make it clear that this was her choice, not something Dakota had asked for. If it damaged his pride with the council, she would take that blame. But she could not sit by and watch people starve when she might be able to do something about it. In the darkest hours before dawn, Sarah dressed warmly and quietly. She left a note for Dakota, written in simple Lakota characters she had learned, explaining what she was doing and why. She took one of the horses that knew her well, a gentle mare named Windrunner, and rode out of camp as silently as possible. The winter moon lit her way across the snow-covered ground. The journey to Fort Laramie took most of the day. Sarah had made note of landmarks during her original journey to the Lakota camp, and she retraced the route carefully. The cold bit through her layers of clothing, and several times she wondered if she was making a terrible mistake. But the image of those hungry children kept her moving forward. When she finally saw the familiar outline of Fort Laramie against the winter sky, relief and anxiety warred within her. The sentries spotted her approach and raised their weapons in alarm before recognizing her. Word spread quickly, and by the time Sarah rode through the gates, her father was already striding across the parade ground toward her, his face a mixture of shock, relief, and concern. Colonel Whitmore helped his daughter down from the horse, examining her with worried eyes, asking if she was hurt, if she had been harmed, if she was trying to escape. Sarah assured him quickly that she was fine, that she had come of her own free will, and that she needed to speak with him urgently and privately. In his office, warmed by a stove and offered hot coffee that tasted like heaven after months without it, Sarah explained the situation. She told her father about the failed hunts, the depleted food stores, the hungry children and weakening elders. She explained how the buffalo herds had been decimated by wasteful hunting, creating a crisis that threatened to wipe out entire communities. Colonel Whitmore listened gravely. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he told her honestly that the situation was complicated. The army did have supplies, but releasing them to the Lakota would require approval from his superiors, and that approval would likely come with conditions and demands. The government would use the leverage of desperate hunger to force more concessions from the tribes. Sarah felt anger flare up inside her. She asked her father how he could stand by and let people starve over political maneuvering. These were human beings, families with children, not chess pieces in some strategic game. Her father looked pained and admitted that he agreed with her, but he was constrained by military orders and government policy. Then Sarah made an appeal not to the colonel but to her father. She reminded him of how her mother had always helped anyone in need, regardless of who they were. She reminded him that he had raised her to believe that honor meant doing what was right, even when it was difficult. She told him that Dakota had prevented multiple attacks on supply wagons and settlements over the past months, that many soldiers were alive today because of his influence for peace, and that letting his people starve now would be a betrayal that would inevitably lead to violence. Colonel Whitmore looked at his daughter, seeing perhaps how much she had changed in the months since he had last seen her. She was thinner and weathered by hard work and harsh conditions, but there was also a strength in her that had not been there before. She spoke with conviction and passion about people he had been trained to see as enemies, and it was clear she truly cared about their welfare. Finally, he made a decision. He would arrange for a supply delivery, but he would do it quietly and frame it as maintaining the peace agreement established by the marriage alliance. It would be enough food to help them through the worst of winter, nothing extravagant that would draw too much attention from his superiors. In return, Sarah needed to make sure Dakota understood this was a gesture of goodwill, not weakness, and that the peace must hold. Sarah agreed gratefully. Her father then insisted she stay the night, eat a proper meal, and rest before making the journey back. Sarah accepted, suddenly exhausted from the long ride and emotional conversation. That evening she wrote a letter to her aunt in Boston, trying to explain her life now, knowing that the woman who had raised her after her mother's death would struggle to understand how Sarah had found meaning and purpose in such an unlikely place. The next morning, Colonel Whitmore had organized a small wagon train of supplies with a military escort. He explained to his men that they were delivering provisions as part of the treaty obligations, carefully avoiding any suggestion that the Lakota had asked for help. Sarah rode alongside the wagons as they made their way back toward the Lakota camp. As they approached the camp, Sarah could see people gathering, warriors moving forward with weapons ready, uncertain of the soldiers' intentions. Her heart pounded with anxiety. This could go terribly wrong if anyone perceived it as an attack or an insult. Then she saw Dakota pushing through the crowd, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. When he reached Sarah, she quickly dismounted and spoke to him in Lakota, loud enough for others to hear. She explained that she had gone to her father without Dakota's knowledge or permission, that this had been entirely her decision, and that she took full responsibility for any offense her actions might have caused. The crowd had grown silent, everyone watching this confrontation. Dakota's jaw was tight with what Sarah recognized as both anger and something else, perhaps fear for her safety. He demanded to know why she had done something so dangerous and reckless. Sarah met his eyes steadily and replied simply that she could not watch children starve when she had the ability to help. She had acted alone to protect his honor and position with the council. If they were angry, their anger should be directed at her, not at him. Several of the council members and warriors who had gathered began arguing among themselves. Some declared this was an insult, that accepting charity from the soldiers would shame them. Others pointed out that the marriage alliance had been meant to create this kind of cooperation, that refusing help out of pride while children went hungry was foolish. The debate grew heated. Then Winona stepped forward from the crowd. The old woman commanded respect, and people quieted to hear her speak. She pointed out that Sarah had risked her life riding alone in winter to help people who were not born into her tribe. She had left the comfort of the fort to return to them, even knowing she might face anger for her choice. This showed where her true loyalty lay. The supplies were not charity, but part of the agreement made when Sarah joined their community. To refuse them would be to insult Sarah's courage and her heart. Other voices joined in support of Winona's words. Dakota stood silent for a long moment, looking at Sarah with an expression she could not quite read. Finally he spoke, his voice carrying across the gathered crowd. He announced that his wife had shown bravery and resourcefulness. She had thought of the welfare of the people above all else, including her own safety and comfort. The supplies would be accepted with gratitude, and the council would remember that Dakota's wife had proven herself a true member of their community, willing to act boldly when action was needed. The crowd murmured approval, though Sarah could see that not everyone was happy with this outcome. The young warriors who had challenged Dakota before looked particularly displeased, muttering among themselves, but the majority seemed relieved at the prospect of food, and families quickly moved forward to help unload the wagons under Dakota's direction. Colonel Whitmore had remained mounted throughout this exchange, not understanding the Lakota words but reading the body language and tension carefully before he turned to lead his men back to the fort. Sarah went to him one final time. They embraced briefly, and he whispered that he was proud of her courage even if he worried about her safety. He told him she would be fine, that she had found her place here, and that she hoped they could maintain this peace for everyone's sake. As the soldiers departed and the supplies were distributed, Dakota pulled Sarah aside into their lodge. For a moment she thought he might be truly angry with her. Instead, he pulled her into a tight embrace, his voice rough as he told her she had terrified him by disappearing, that he had imagined all sorts of terrible fates that might have befallen her traveling alone. Sarah apologized for frightening him, but said she would not apologize for her choice. Dakota pulled back to look at her face, and slowly a small smile appeared. He told her that he understood why she had done it, that her heart was as fierce as any warrior's, and that he was grateful for what she had accomplished even if her methods had been reckless. Then his expression grew more serious, and he said something that made Sarah's heart swell with emotion. He said that she was no longer just his wife in name, but truly his partner, someone he trusted and relied on, someone he had come to deeply care for. That night, as the camp settled with full stomachs for the first time in weeks, Sarah and Dakota lay together in their lodge, their bond deepened by the challenges they had faced and overcome together. Spring arrived like a promise kept, melting the snow and bringing new green growth across the prairie. The supplies Sarah had secured helped the people survive the worst of winter, and now the world was coming back to life. Hunting parties returned with success more often, finding deer and elk that had also survived the harsh months. Birds filled the air with song, and children who had been quiet and listless through winter now ran and played with renewed energy. Sarah stood outside her lodge one morning, breathing in the fresh air and feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She placed a hand on her belly, still flat but holding a secret that filled her with both joy and terror. She was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks now, and Winona had confirmed it just days ago with a knowing smile and warm embrace. Sarah had not yet told Dakota. She wanted to find the right moment, the right words. This child would be born into a world caught between two cultures, carrying the blood of both the Lakota and the white settlers who were increasingly encroaching on their lands. What kind of future would this baby have? The question kept Sarah awake at night. That afternoon, she decided it was time. She prepared Dakota's favorite meal, a rich stew with roots and herbs that he particularly enjoyed. When he returned from a council meeting, she could see the stress on his face. The meetings had been difficult lately, filled with arguments about the future and what choices they should make. But when he entered their lodge and saw the food prepared, his expression softened. They ate together in comfortable silence at first. Then Sarah reached across and took his hand, her heart beating fast. She told him in Lakota, speaking slowly to make sure she got the words exactly right, that they were going to have a child. For a moment, Dakota simply stared at her, processing the information. Then his face transformed, with an emotion so pure and powerful that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. He pulled her into his arms, holding her carefully, as if she had suddenly become fragile. He spoke rapidly in Lakota, words of joy and gratitude and promise. He told her he would build her a better lodge, more comfortable and spacious. He would make sure she had everything she needed. He would protect both her and their child with his life. Sarah laughed through her tears, telling him she did not need a bigger lodge. She just needed him. Over the next weeks, Dakota became almost comically protective. He did not want Sarah doing heavy work, though. She insisted she was perfectly fine, and that Lakota women worked through their pregnancies all the time. Winona found his hovering amusing and shooed him away regularly, telling him that Sarah was strong and healthy and did not need to be treated like she was made of glass. But beneath the joy, Sarah felt a growing anxiety. She heard things in the camp, whispers and rumors, that troubled her deeply. The United States government was making new demands. They wanted the Black Hills, a sacred area to the Lakota, land that held deep spiritual significance and had been guaranteed to them in treaties. Gold had been discovered there, and suddenly all previous promises meant nothing. The council meetings grew longer and more heated. Dakota came home late most nights, exhausted and troubled. He told Sarah about the impossible choices facing them. Some leaders wanted to fight, to defend their sacred lands no matter the cost. Others argued that fighting was suicide, that the army's numbers were too great, their weapons too powerful. Some suggested negotiating, trying to find compromise. Others said negotiation was pointless when the government had broken every previous agreement. Sarah listened and offered what comfort she could, but she felt helpless. She understood both sides in a way that pained her. She knew her father and many soldiers were just following orders, not evil men, but caught in a system that demanded they take land and push native peoples aside. But she also knew the Lakota were fighting for their very existence, for their way of life, for their children's future. There was no easy answer, no simple solution. One evening, a messenger arrived at the fort. Sarah's father had sent word requesting to see her. It was urgent. Dakota was immediately suspicious and reluctant to let her go, but Sarah convinced him she should find out what her father wanted. Perhaps it was information that could help them navigate the crisis. Dakota insisted on escorting her himself, along with several warriors. At Fort Laramie, Colonel Whitmore greeted his daughter with obvious relief at seeing her well and noticing the slight curve of her belly that was just beginning to show. He congratulated her on the coming child, his expression bittersweet. Then his face grew serious, and he asked to speak with both Sarah and Dakota privately. In his office, the colonel explained the situation bluntly. The government was going to take the Black Hills, one way or another. Already, miners were flooding into the area illegally, and the army was being pressured to protect them rather than remove them as the treaties required. War was coming. He was certain of it. When it came, it would be brutal and devastating. He had called Sarah here to warn her and to offer her a chance to leave. If fighting broke out, he could not guarantee her safety, even though she was his daughter. He urged her to return to the fort, or better yet, to go back east to her aunt where she would be completely safe. The baby could be born in civilization with proper medical care. Sarah felt Dakota stiffen beside her. She knew this offer, however well-intentioned, felt like a betrayal to him. She looked at her father and spoke clearly, her voice steady. She thanked him for his concern and his love, but her place was with her husband and her adopted people. She would not abandon them when they faced their darkest hour, her father argued, his voice rising with frustration and fear. He painted vivid pictures of what war would mean, the violence, the potential for her to be caught in crossfire or worse. He begged her to think of her unborn child, to give the baby a chance at a safe life. Sarah's response was firm. This baby would be both Lakota and white, and she would not teach her child that one half of their heritage was something to run from. She had made her choice when she married Dakota, and that choice had deepened into genuine love and commitment. She would stay. Dakota, who had been silent throughout this exchange, finally spoke. He addressed the colonel respectfully but honestly. He said he understood a father's desire to protect his child, that he would soon be a father himself and could imagine that fear. But Sarah was no longer just the colonel's daughter. She was Dakota's wife, a member of the Lakota community, and she had earned her place through courage and dedication. He would protect her and their child with everything he had. Colonel Whitmore looked between them, seeing their united front, and his shoulders sagged with resignation. He made one final plea. If things became too dangerous, if Sarah needed to escape, she should come to the fort. He would always help her, always give her sanctuary. But he could see he had lost this argument. Before they left, the colonel pulled Sarah aside one more time. He told her quietly that he admired her strength, even as it terrified him. He gave her a small package, inside of which she later discovered was her mother's silver locket, with a tiny portrait inside, along with a letter he had written for his future grandchild. He wanted the baby to know that their grandfather loved them, even if circumstances kept them apart. The ride back to camp was quiet. Dakota seemed lost in thought, and Sarah wrestled with her own complicated emotions. She did not regret her decision, but saying what might be a final goodbye to her father had been harder than she expected. That night, lying in Dakota's arms, Sarah felt the first tiny flutter of movement in her belly. The baby. Her hand flew to the spot, and Dakota felt her sudden movement. When she explained what had happened, he placed his own hand there, waiting hopefully. After a moment, there was another small flutter like butterfly wings against her skin. Dakota's face filled with wonder, and Sarah saw tears in his eyes for the first time. In that moment, despite all the uncertainty and danger surrounding them, Sarah felt a profound sense of rightness. This was where she belonged. This child growing inside her was a symbol of hope, a bridge between two worlds that seemed determined to destroy each other. Summer brought the crisis everyone had feared. The government issued an ultimatum. All Lakota bands must report to reservations by a certain date or be considered hostile. The demand was impossible to meet, both practically and philosophically. Many bands were in remote areas and would never receive the message in time. Others refused on principle to be herded onto small parcels of land, confined and controlled like prisoners. Dakota and the other leaders knew what this meant. The army would come. Fighting was inevitable. Preparations began in earnest. Warriors checked weapons and gathered ammunition. Families packed essential items they could carry if they needed to flee. Plans were made for where women, children, and elders should go if battle came to the camp. Sarah, now clearly pregnant and moving more slowly, worked alongside the other women. She helped prepare food stores, organize medical supplies for treating wounded, and made sure the children understood what to do if they heard the warning signals. Winona stayed close to her, protective and concerned. One afternoon, scouts raced into camp with alarming news. A large cavalry force was moving through the area, and their trajectory suggested they were searching for the camp. Panic rippled through the people. Dakota immediately organized the warriors and gave orders for the vulnerable to move to a more protected location in a nearby canyon. Sarah joined the group of women, children, and elders, making the journey to safety. They moved as quickly as possible, but it was still slow going with so many young children and older people who struggled with the pace. Sarah helped carry supplies and keep the children calm, all while fear gnawed at her insides. Dakota had stayed behind with the warriors to delay any pursuing soldiers and give the others time to reach safety. Hours passed in tense waiting. Sarah sat with Winona and several other women, listening for sounds of gunfire, praying that Dakota and the others would return unharmed. The children sensed the adults' fear and stayed unusually quiet. Some of the younger ones clung to their mothers, wide-eyed and scared. As the sun began to set, they finally heard horses approaching. Everyone tensed, ready to run deeper into the canyon if needed. Then a familiar voice called out in Lakota, and relief flooded through the group. The warriors were returning, and by some miracle, there had been no battle. The cavalry had turned back, apparently called away by other orders. When Dakota found Sarah among the crowd, he pulled her into his arms despite the audience of onlookers. She felt him trembling slightly, the aftermath of adrenaline and fear. He had been terrified that he would not see her again, that their child would grow up without a father. Sarah held him tightly, grateful beyond words that he had returned safely, but they both knew this was only a temporary reprieve. The pressure was building from all sides. More white settlers arrived daily on lands that were supposed to be protected. More miners invaded the Black Hills. More broken promises piled upon broken promises. War was not a question of if, but when. Summer turned toward autumn. Sarah's belly grew round and full. She felt the baby moving constantly now, strong kicks and turns that made her laugh and wince simultaneously. Winona estimated the child would come with the first snow, and she began teaching Sarah what to expect during labor and birth. The prospect terrified Sarah, but she tried to focus on the joy of meeting her child rather than the pain of bringing them into the world. One evening, as Sarah and Dakota sat outside their lodge watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of orange and pink, they talked about their child's future. Dakota admitted his fears that there might be no future for the Lakota, that their way of life was ending whether they fought or surrendered. Sarah refused to accept such despair. She insisted that their child, carrying both heritages, could perhaps help build bridges, help both peoples understand each other. Dakota smiled sadly at her optimism, but did not argue. Instead, he talked about what he wanted to teach their child: how to ride, how to track animals, how to respect the earth and all living things. He wanted to pass on the stories and traditions of his people to make sure that even if everything else was taken from them, their child would know who they were and where they came from. Sarah added her own hopes. She wanted to teach their child to read and write in both English and Lakota. She wanted them to understand both cultures, to take the best from each world. She wanted them to grow up knowing they were loved, that they belonged to both peoples, and that they had the strength to face whatever challenges came. As the first snow began to fall several weeks later, Sarah went into labor. Winona and several experienced women gathered to help, sending Dakota away as was customary. He paced outside the lodge like a caged animal, while inside Sarah worked through waves of pain that were worse than anything she had imagined. The labor lasted through the night and into the next day. There were moments when Sarah thought she could not continue, when the pain was too great. But Winona's steady presence and the encouraging words of the other women kept her going. Finally, as afternoon sun filtered through the lodge walls, a baby's cry split the air. A girl. Sarah held her daughter for the first time, this tiny perfect being with a shock of dark hair and eyes that seemed to look right into her soul. Winona cleaned the baby and wrapped her in soft furs, then went to fetch Dakota. When Dakota entered and saw his daughter, his face transformed with such love and wonder that Sarah started crying all over again. He knelt beside them, reaching out tentatively to touch the baby's tiny hand. Her fingers wrapped around his thumb, and he was completely lost to her in that instant. They named her Zitkala, which meant little bird, and gave her the middle name Grace, honoring Sarah's mother. Zitkala Grace would grow up between two worlds, but she would do so surrounded by love from both. As Sarah sat in their lodge that evening, Dakota beside her and their daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms, she thought about the journey that had brought her here. She had been forced into a marriage with a stranger, dragged into a world she did not understand, stripped of everything familiar. Yet somehow, impossibly, she had found a home. She had found purpose and belonging. She had found love in the last place she ever expected. The future remained uncertain. The challenges facing them were enormous and perhaps insurmountable. But looking at her daughter's peaceful face, at Dakota's protective presence, feeling the warmth and acceptance of the community that had become her family, Sarah knew one thing absolutely. She had made the right choice. She was exactly where she was meant to be, and she would face whatever came next with the strength and courage that both her peoples had given her. She had never expected to find love when she was forced to marry a Lakota war chief for peace, but love had found her anyway, transforming everything she thought she knew about herself, about others, about what truly mattered in life. And that love, she was certain, would sustain them through whatever storms lay ahead.